that enjoy books and anime. So, yeah, let's look at this code here. And yeah, I can see some faces that look exactly like this guy. Right? Like, what's going on here? I see those that are not technical. Why do we have some things called tuna? Apparently, the developer was working on this project like he was really hungry for some fish or something, so he was really not responsible about naming variables. We see an ID there, and why do we have such characters there? I don't think we should have some hard-coded IDs. And also, what's going on here? This is very ugly. Why is there query in a for loop? This is gonna be very, very, very ugly to see. And this code shouldn't be approved at all because it's not respecting any of the best practices, which are now standard rules. We don't consider them just best practices, but they have to be there. So I'm gonna go through the content now, and we're gonna view some of these best practices and how we can include them in our code, which is gonna be very simple. So I classified them as 5-point: scalable design, security, performance, reusability, and maintainability. And I added another part where we're gonna do a little practice about some of these practices so we can see them in work. And finally, we're gonna have some QA to answer some of your questions, guys. All right, so the first one, scalable design. We want our code to have a very beautiful design so that it can be scalable and it can be very easy to read, very easy to reuse, very well architectured, so that we can also have more code without any problems, without any bugs in the future. We want it to be very secure because, after all, data is very important for every company, and we have to make sure that it's very well secured and also that the code won't have any problems in the security matters. We want the performance to be very nice with no problems. We don't want to slow down the process of anything that we're automating in our project. We want it to keep reusing some of the functions so that we can also take advantage of time. After all, time is money for our businesses. And we want to have a reusable code so that when we implement new features, we can use partially some of the old code. And finally, maintainability. We need to have like the maintenance in hand. We don't want to spend a lot of time and a lot of budget trying to fix some old errors that might take us a lot of time. So we want our code to be very easy maintained by simple steps, simple hours, not much. And as you can see, these circles have some kind of intersections because actually a lot of them can have the same best practices. For example, yeah, the performance. Some can also argue that some of these best practices can be considered as well in the scalable design. And I won't disagree with that because it's true. So I'm gonna start with the first one, code bulkification and optimizations. We want to bulkify our code, so it also will look pretty. We won't have to repeat a lot of things in the same class or in different classes as well. We want to avoid, definitely avoid, DMLs and SOQ and for loops, as you can see in the meme. Like, she got dumped just because she used this best practices. She didn't use it, right? And finally, querying large data sets. It's very helpful. Process large chunks of data using queuables, which is a very nice feature that Salesforce introduced in the latest releases. Avoid nested loops, because sometimes in some scenarios, it's unavoidable. We will have to use many loops, but just try to avoid them. And here the architecture come in hand, so if we have a very steady architecture, avoiding nested loops is gonna become very simple. And finally, we can use the platform cache from Salesforce that will provide memory layer. And yeah, it's gonna be also a very easy way to use data without querying a lot of it every time. Security. We want to enforce the CRUD, create, read, update, delete rules, and the FLS, field level security, by simple steps, thanks to Salesforce and its latest also additions and features. So before doing any action on any record, we can use some schema methods to make sure that the record is accessible, updatable, deletable by a simple line. We can also use the with security enforced in each SOQL query. we can use this method, security strip unaccessible, to clear field values on list of is objects that the user doesn't have access to. And database operations in user mode. This is very important. Here you can see it. So the user mode, we have access to FLS, share rules, group permissions, and those are respected in the user mode. Unlike the system mode, where they're not respected. So it's very necessary, actually, to use the database operations in that case. And finally, the use of sharing clauses. So whenever we create a new Apex class, you can find by default like with sharing, but we can also update it without sharing and erase sharing. And actually, there's one point about this part, is that, for example, if class A is without sharing and it's using a method from class B that is with sharing, so the method from class B that was being class A is gonna apply the sharing of its main class, which is gonna be with sharing in that case. I hope I didn't confuse it. Now scalable design and reusability, because there's a lot of intersection about these two parts. So first of all, it's good to adapt a design pattern. As an example, Apex Enterprise pattern, based on selector, service, domain. And basically, it's just like we organize the work of each feature in our code. So we put, for example, the queries in a part, and we store them there, so we can each time call them in our services. Or, for example, in the Java architecture, we use data managers and entity managers that are being called by service managers. And also, it's going to be very easy to use these classes in batches, etc. It's good to adapt a trigger framework. Not everybody does it. If we have like few triggers in our projects, but when it becomes very complicated, it's very nice to have a trigger framework so that we won't have to repeat a lot of code, and also it's going to be very easy to maintain. Here's another intersection. And finally, test data factory. We don't want in each test class to keep creating more data. We want to put that on a factory, on one class, and we're just going to keep having this data and drop it on our test classes, and it's going to be also easy to maintain. Yeah, maintenance. Everybody loves it. Yay! First of all, let's start with the coding convention and standards. This is a very important one. We learn it at first when we start coding, and it's about the naming conventions. It's a standard one between a lot of languages. We want our variables to have meaning, easy to read, easy to understand by our developer colleagues. Also, definitely avoid hard-coded ID, forbidden. Use PMD to scan the code, which can be find very easy in extensions on Visual Studio Code. And it's like the first example that I showed you, there was this yellow line under the isOQL query inside the for loop. And that was the PMD telling me, please update this code because you cannot use that. And finally, we can implement a CI/CD for the project. We have a lot of CI/CDs. We can also, in the configurations of these CI/CDs, when they implement them at first in the project, adapt them and tell them, please, before deploying a code using that methods, please review, if we have isOQL queries inside the VM loops. Please review if we not exceeding the complexity of each classes, and that CI/CD will automatically stop that deployment and return an error to the developer, telling them, please review your code, you have this error. And it's also very helpful to maintain the best practices in our project. Tests. Everybody loves tests, right? Of course we don't. And that's why developers and testers don't have a really, really, really nice relationship. I mean, they always find this loophole in our code that sometimes we are very proud of building, and we're like, I'm not gonna get this ticket back. And it happens with me with a colleague back, and she's like, we have found a negative scenario, you have to rebuild this code. And that's why it's very important to test negative test scenarios. It's very also standard to use mocks for testing callouts. Restricted user context testing is also very important to use. And the asserts are helpful to read the errors of the test classes. So it's good to have one assert method with an error message. And actually, in the last release of Salesforce, Salesforce introduced new methods for the asserts. So are equal, are not equal, for, etc., that you can see here in my screen. And definitely avoid that little part there, because it's not really very friendly to use in our code. It's very bad also for security. The CL data equal true. All right, let's practice this. So I'm going to introduce you now to two developers who are going to join us. We have Jim and Dwight. I think you're very familiar with the office, so these two decided to just quit what they were doing and decided to convert to Salesforce. Dwight was very smart about it because he's always very careful about his career, so he converted to Salesforce first, and then Jim, because he loves Dwight, ironically, right? So he joined Dwight in the Salesforce industry, and they became two developers. So for these two, they have this very simple task about updating an account number when the contact number changes. So it's going to be built on a trigger. Let's see how they're going to do that. Actually, it's Jim's task. So Dwight only approved that request. So that's nice. Yeah, he built a trigger per framework. He have a trigger handler where the method is called. And he installed the logic on a trigger, which is a best practice as well. As you can see, the contact trigger class that uses the after update helper. And on his class, it's with sharing by default. And yeah, he didn't use nested for loops, which is nice. So he put his ID at first in a set. Also, it's a good practice so that he can find unique IDs and no duplicates at all. Yeah, he stored the account IDs. He did this query very nicely. He then, used a nested for loops. And then he updated his account item list, therefore the phone number. You can see the yellow lines. That's the PMG. So PMG actually is signaling to Jim that you cannot use that. What's going on and what's wrong? So Jim pushed this code in a request, and Dwight had to approve it before it goes to the system. So yeah, this was Dwight's updates. So apparently they had a trigger handler in their code. And this trigger handler used a method run that runs with many trigger handlers or helpers. So he just used it instead of that logic that Jim had. And on his trigger handler, he also used another class, trigger helper. Interesting. And in his trigger helper, he have this method update account phone, where he passed the new inserted list that need to be inserted, updated, or whatever the trigger is called for. So the trigger helper, wow, that looks really long, right? Longer than Jim. But isn't it this one easy to use for future implementations? Isn't it very easy to implement and read? I think so. So he's first of all put the queries inside different methods. So he put his account IDs in a different method. He also had the maps so that he can avoid the nested for loops. And also, he put the logic there and there, and he made sure that he respects security by checking that the record is updatable by the schema method line here. And we don't see any yellow lines, so the PMG is very happy with this code. But I still think that also this one needs some updates. Does someone have any more refactoring to do for this code? Otherwise, I can probably jump here, because I also thought that this code was really nicely done, but probably also it's very obvious a bit. So this one can be put probably in a selector class or in a class that we put our queries so that we can use it easier later, and also we can easily secure it. Probably this one, we can add like a variable here with a string that indicates the API field names, so that future developers just to include like the API name of the fields that we want to add to the query, because this query is really short, and yeah, we don't want to mess with it every time. So we can just add like a list of strings here that will indicate the API name of the fields that a future developer would need on his future methods. That's in the top of my head. Probably one of you or some of you have more refactoring to do. Probably some of you have to like make things differently. That's very known, very famous in the developers' world. We rarely agree on one approach, and we always have these creative ways to easily implement new features. And that's the fun part about it. We are being more creative about making sure really that our code is the best in the best, in the best way. But that's something I can add also to this session. I know that it's just for Apex, and I know that developers love code, love looking like hackers with these black fancy IDs, and they're like always, yeah, I can code it, yeah. But in each release, Salesforce add new automation tools. It add new features that can all actually help us stop coding many simple features. And that's why probably this feature can be implemented using a very simple automation tool like the flows. So our lead developer, Jim, I was like, yeah, that's a lot of work. And he's very lazy. And also he's looking for the easy way to do stuff. So we just told them, yeah, we can do it with flows, why not, right? I mean, it's just one record, it's one update on one field, why don't we need to use Apex? But I just used that example to ease the process of explaining some of the best practices I needed to explain in my session. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, guys. Thank you for your for your attention, and yeah, feel free to ask any questions. Yeah, if any of you guys have any questions or anything to add or opinion, just raise your hand. I will give you the mic so that you can give your your opinion or question. First of all, how was the session? Did you enjoy it? I tried to make it fun. Yeah? All right, guys. I think it's time. And yeah, if anyone have questions, just feel free to ask, and I will be here.